We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that.
I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so I thought dressing like a pimp might make it a little bit easier. I have blogs where you can read stuff and see things and interact with me. My main one is postmortemstudios.wordpress.com. My writing one and sort of diary blog is over at talesofgrim.wordpress.com. Hope to see you there. A very kind viewer sent me a copy of The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, and I said I'd get around to reading it and reviewing it, and it took longer than I meant it to because I've been incredibly busy and I burnt myself out a bit. In it, Haidt takes a lot of pages, nearly 400 pages, to say things that I regard as fairly obvious for the most part. But then I also realised reading this that I'm a bit of a freak, a bit of an outlier, a bit of a sport, really, in that I have thought about these things and had these revelations, and a lot of people haven't. So I guess there's going to be a somewhat personal review. One of the main points he makes in this is that we're not the rational thinkers that we would like to think that we are, that we tend to intuit an answer and then we post hoc rationalize that using our conscious minds rather than most of the time making conscious decision making. Now, part of the idea behind cognitive behavioral therapy is that you train your mind to make more conscious decisions rather than intuitive decisions, because your intuitive decision-making process is screwed up, which is what is affecting your mental health. And that by stepping back, you can retrain your mind to think in a more rational way, to assess things in a way that has a slightly more bearing to reality, right? Because if you need CBT for, say, depression, your intuitions tend to be incredibly negative, and the reality of the situation is probably not what your intuition is. CBT has never particularly worked for me because it felt like a positive thinking exercise, and also I think because I was already doing that. So it would seem that my rational assessment of my situation is what's making me depressed, not an actual cognitive shift. But nonetheless, the point is largely valid. We're like riders on an elephant, which is how he puts it. The rider is much smaller. If the elephant decides to go a particular way, there's not a lot the rider can do about it, but the rider can hope to perhaps somewhat direct the elephant with a carrot or a stick or whatever else. But in understanding and realizing that that's what we're doing, there is some power in that, and it opens up the possibility that the rider can direct the elephant a bit more. Now, a similar topic was brought up, I think, on the Weinstein's podcast. I've been listening to a few of those, but they've kind of revealed their bourgeois selves a bit in that. But they made an interesting point in that most of the people that we take as moral leaders or as moral exemplars tend to be people who have taken that step back and who tend to consciously think about their moral decisions and so on, and can then articulate that rational process. Of course, a lot of people also fall short, or if you completely step back and use your reason on moral problems, you can come to conclusions that we intuit to be wrong and disgusting, and for a lot of people that's an impossible level to overcome. There's a short story, science fiction story, called If All Men Were Brothers, Would You Let One Marry Your Sister? Which took a kind of thought experiment, taking some psychological ideas from the time, from Freud and so on, and posited a hidden planetary society in space where there was no taboo against incest, and made the argument that this was perfectly fine and laudable, because so long as two consenting adults wanted to engage in such behaviour, why should we stop them in a time of near perfect contraception and access to abortion and all the rest of it? And that we had all these psychological complexes and things around incest, that it didn't make any sense to stop people and to screw them up by not allowing it at a time when the taboo didn't make any sense. Yeah, and that is, for all Freud's ideas have fallen by the wayside, that is a logical and rational argument to make, but it's also a situation and a moral decision that I think everyone intuits to be disgusting and beyond the pale, and so on, right? So that can lead you into some difficult areas, but even so, the people that we do tend to see as moral exemplars do tend to be people who do that, who step back and think through it, for all that there would be missteps on the way. He discusses the origin of morality and ethics, and by and large agrees with me, though I'm obviously somewhat biased in favour of this particular hypothesis, that our morals and ethics basically come about because we're a social species. And a social species relies on different members. Now, we're not eusocial. He doesn't use the technical term that often in the book, but a eusocial creature is something like an ant or a bee or a wasp. You know, these are creatures that live socially, but they're all genetic copies, essentially. They're all children of the main queen, so they're all related. So the individual sacrifice is essentially meaningless for the good of the whole. Now, we're not that. We're somewhere between ants and chimps. Chimps form troop societies. They have crude moral technologies, morals and ethics. They don't like being cheated. You know, a leader tends to emerge, though they're also kept in check by the others. It's quite brutal. And you can see the kind of seeds of early tribal societies in chimp behaviour to an extent. But the point is that we do rely on each other, largely because we have children who take a very long time to develop, and it takes a village to raise a child, as has been said. So because we rely on each other, it only makes sense, it's only natural that we would not like cheating, that we would hate it when people harmed children in any way, shape or form, that we put a high value on altruism in whatever form that takes, and we put a low value on selfishness. But we're part individual and part social, but we're not quite eusocial. We don't live in actual literal hives, only mental ones, not really biological ones. Kinship groups aren't that big. So it's from that basis, that is as close to an objective morality that you can get, I think, is altruism good, selfishness bad, right? And that we should, to one extent or another, help each other with a much stronger bond for our kinship groups who share our genes. That's just the way it works. But that would seem to be the origin of morals and ethics. But then we've then developed mental software over that physical basis, tools essentially, which are moral and ethical coded systems of laws, religions, taboos, and so on. And I think this is an important thing that people really need to realise wherever they are on the political spectrum, whatever moral schema they currently subscribe to, that there is no absolute right and wrong in any of this, that our moral systems are tools that we have created, that we have developed, that we use to craft our societies and our personal relationships and so on, and that they are all necessarily subjective, and that the closest you can get to an objective morality is that biological basis, in that we're social animals with high demands for child rearing, so altruism good, selfishness bad. You know, you should treat each other fairly, you should maintain relatively harmonious social relationships. That's as close as you can get to an objective morality, and that's still a morality that's only true for humans, not universally across everything, obviously. Haidt seems somewhat skeptical of people like Sam Harris and the other new atheists, which we'll touch on in a minute, but he seems skeptical of the idea of the moral landscape, that we can discern some sort of universal morality from the way things are, so that we can get an ought from an is, which is an argument that Sam Harris makes. There's a very good TED talk where he's talking about the moral landscape. Is it generally conducive to human happiness that everyone be tortured from the moment of their birth to the moment of their death? Yeah, we can say, no. Is it more conducive to human happiness and well-being if everyone is treated well, if everyone is fed and housed and so on from the moment of their birth to the moment of their death? We can probably say yes there, right? So once you've established that there is a scale of suffering versus positive human outcomes, then we can say that there is some sort of objective measure, but there may be many solutions between those 2 points. How can we maximize human happiness and fulfillment for the largest number of people? And there might be various answers to that problem. But you just have to look at that extreme example to say that there is something we can say is as near to objectively bad as makes no odds, and there is something that is near to objectively good as makes no odds. So we can make judgments about societies, moral schemes, ethical schemes, and so on. He spends a bit of time talking about moral foundations, and that liberals or left-wing people tend to have a smaller cluster of moral foundations, such as fairness and justice and so on, while conservatives have a more complex set of moral value systems that might include some things like in-group preference or honour or tradition. These aren't the words that he uses, but it's a more illustrative example, I think, that people can see more easily. Now, any idea taken to an extreme can be horribly dangerous, but even though conservative moral schemes might be more complex, they're often in competition with each other within their moral scheme. But also conservatives tend to be more tribalistic, more hivish, while liberals and left-wingers oddly tend to not be, tend to be more individualistic. That might seem counterintuitive because we think of communitarian thinking as being something on the left, but when you look at things like nationalism or religious affiliation, these are much more strongly expressed on the right than the left. And when we talk about the left's collectivism, we're really talking about things like communism and so on, which, when you really delve into it, is more about the individual than people think. It's that maximizing of human dignity and flourishing is the appeal, right? But both sides have their communitarian thinkers. I think the main point of this book is an exhortation to people to try and understand the moral systems, the value systems of other people. And I don't know necessarily that it succeeds on that. For me, as a radical left-wing person of the old school, being a left-wing anarchist, I didn't find that this enabled me to better understand either the American pseudo-left liberal groups that are currently ascendant, nor did it particularly help me to understand the conservatives any better than I already did. On an intellectual level, I can kind of understand these points of view and how they've gotten out of hand, how the right wing, for example, latches on to the idea of the nation, as this is a block of people working together for mutual benefit, except that they end up not working together for mutual benefit. And on the other side, I can see how the valuing of fairness can get out of hand and become distorted to the point where it's unfair, where the idea of fairness gets distorted to the point where they start altering things in the opposite direction to oppress the groups that used to be ascendant and to elevate the groups that used to be beneath, and end up being such horrendous hypocrites on that. And I can also kind of intellectually see how the idea of self-reliance on the right is meant to be something that helps people, forcing people to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And so I can kind of see where the argument is, and I think that points to how the underlying moral system that comes from our genetics, our biology, how that is still altruism good, selfishness bad, whichever wing you happen to be on. Because to the right wing, the most altruistic thing to do is not to give people fish, it's to teach them to fish. Right? Whereas on the left, the right thing to do would be to, you have people who fish, you have people who don't fish. Those who can fish produce a surplus of fish, which should then be distributed to everybody. Right? Because other people are going to be doing things that others can't, and that will also be distributed, so everyone's treated fairly. Everyone gets a bit of a boost out of that. But conservative values are an outside context problem for me. I do not understand nationalism. Right? I can understand it in a sort of economic way, why people want to tighten up the borders, even though it's counterproductive and so on. But a nation is nothing more than an arbitrary set of lines on a map, for the most part. Right? Political ideologies transcend national boundaries. Other value systems and so on transcend national boundaries, and we live in a wired-up world. I was an early adopter of the internet, so the idea of national boundaries just doesn't make that much sense to me, and indeed is actually incredibly frustrating, because we live in this globally communicative world, but we can't move as freely around it as we can communicate clearly around it. Yeah, so I don't understand nationalism, and I don't understand race preference. It makes no sense to me. The differences between the so-called races are so utterly minor outside of extreme situations that it's pointless to even consider them. Right? We're all one species, Homo sapiens sapiens, and dividing people up it makes no sense whatsoever. We have far more in common than we have differences. Supposed racial IQ differences don't exist, really, once you compensate for things like diet and access to education and poverty and life stress and all the rest of these issues that all affect IQ far more than the genetic variants ever really could. They say that people of West African descent have an average IQ 15 points lower, but if you just compensate for diet can account for 15 IQ points. So if you're malnourished, this is a lifelong effect, which is why immigrants will tend to have lower IQs, and they also come into the country and they have less access to education, which can have a negative effect on IQ, and so on and so on. It's just pulling this out as an example, because I've been arguing with white supremacists in my videos debunking the Kalergi plan, right? But they put so much stock in race, and it's just a complete outside context problem for me. It makes no sense to me. And part of what he talks about is this idea of Homo economicus, which is a somewhat outmoded and outdated idea, still found quite rampant in economics and in conservative philosophy, that people will do things that are in their own best interest, which obviously isn't true when you look at the world and you look at how people vote, how you look at the way in which the working classes, for example, consistently vote against their own interests. And Haidt argues convincingly that this is due to having other moral ideas, moral schemes, but other identities, like the national identity, and wanting to signal their membership to their group and their loyalty to their group over and above what would be good for them, even though what's good for them would also probably be good for a whole host of other people. To pluck an example out of the air, for example, a huge number of the American working classes will vote consistently against universal healthcare because it smacks of socialism and communism and all of these other things. Never mind that every other industrialized nation ahead of the US in terms of quality of healthcare has some sort of public healthcare system. They're just dead set against it, even though they benefit from it, even though a whole host of other people would benefit from it, even though it would be cheaper and more effective. I think if they followed a UK-style model, for example, total US healthcare spending would drop by about a third, and the quality of that care would go up enormously. And in fact, America is in a much better position to get even better quality healthcare than the UK under a UK model, just because of the sheer economy of scale. You can look at how people voted for Trump, and at least he was telling them the kind of things that they wanted to hear. He was promising to help them. He never did, of course, but those were at least the right signals. Whereas if you look at Brexit over here, people were voting to shoot themselves repeatedly in the foot. And it's harder to understand, but the appeal there was not to Homo economicus, which to an extent Trump was making, but to these national and racial loyalties, which is why Brexit gets tarred as being racist, even though that's not the entire story. There is nationalism, definitely, which tends to conflate with racism. But for me, the conservative point of view, the idea of signalling your membership to a group through your voting and through your ideology just makes no sense to me. There's one other example which I've made before, which I want to make again, that proves that people are thinking emotionally rather than thinking, right? So here in the UK, supposedly we have this big problem with benefit fraud. People claiming to be unemployed when they're not, people claiming to be sick when they're not, all the rest of it. For at least 1 year, I think it was around the year 2000, we spent more pursuing benefit cheats than was actually lost through benefit cheating. So if we think of the average person as a rational actor, a Homo economicus, wouldn't it make more financial sense not to bother deliberately looking for anyone who was cheating and just kind of have a passive detection system that didn't cost a whole lot of money? But no, people are willing to make many other people's lives harder and to spend more money to punish cheats, even though the concern is economic, or at least masquerades as being economic. You know, they are happy to pay additional money to hurt other people if they are going to catch some cheats. That's a great example of non-Homo economicus thinking, essentially. But the whole thing is an outside context problem for me when it comes to conservatives, and similarly, I do not understand identity politics on the pseudo-left. I don't understand why you would elevate such meaningless, pointless things as race or gender or sexuality to such high levels of importance, because that just perpetuates inequality and stops you considering people as individuals and their needs as individuals. Another way in which I think I am weird is that I don't seem to have the Hive Switch. Now, this is this idea that Haidt has that we most of the time operate as individuals or within a troop, but that sometimes something could get triggered in us that makes us act in a more hive-like way. We lose ourselves in the moment in a church congregation or a football crowd or at a concert or a gig, or when we're really, really fucking high on psilocybin or something. Yeah, and you lose yourself in that moment. And weirdly, again, going against what we might think, it's conservatives who tend to be more hivish on race, on nationality, in terms of their political identity. Conservatives tend to be more like that, whereas liberals, the left, tend to be more individuated in their thinking. I think that's part of the reason why the left is incapable of uniting in the same way that the right is. And again, there are contradictions to this, such as communism and so on, but then you look at how communism worked out, and it was never actually communism, and you can see, I think that in many ways, the things we think of as being historical examples of left-wing despotism and so on were actually very conservative, very nationalistic, often very racist, defined themselves really by conservative moral schema and ethical values rather than actual left-wing ones. This isn't an attempt to pass the buck. That would be as stupid as trying to claim that Hitler was a socialist, but I think it's worth examining how things actually went and how they contradicted the ideology that was available. But I don't seem to have the Hive Switch. I can't say that I've ever felt that sense of transcendent loss of self in any of these kind of situations, and that may mean that there's something wrong with me. I suppose I'm always quite detached. I think the closest I ever got was being swept up in Gamergate, but even then I felt that I was somehow apart from it and I was observing it, and that I was the one raising points of caution about people like Milo Yiannopoulos and so on. There were others, of course, as well, but I've never felt overtaken by that mob mentality. When I'm at a gig, I feel detached from the crowd, like I am observing it rather than participating in it. Even under an heroic dose of mushrooms, I never lost my sense of self. It was a very insular, self-exploratory set of experiences. People talk about communities and they seem to assign some sort of hive mind to that, whereas to me a community is just a group of people who are interested in the same thing and interact. I don't feel any obligation to agree with the community that I'm part of. I can feel disappointed when they don't share my values and so on, or values that I consider to be incredibly important to that community, such as free expression and creativity in the role-playing community. And I've been burned plenty of times, but I do not seem to feel this transcendent sense of being part of something bigger, which seems to be a big aspect of spirituality for some people. I don't feel the presence of God. I don't feel like a single pixel in humanity's noosphere. It's just this is a completely alien idea to me, to be anything other than myself. So I cannot understand that any more than I can really fully grok conservative viewpoints, especially when it comes to things that we actually have information on. So it's very hard for me to understand that communalistic thinking, despite me being very left-wing. But I think I can understand that because right-wing communitarianism is on the basis of the things that don't matter, immutable characteristics. And for a lot of the new left, it's about that kind of identity as well. Whereas left-wing old-school ideology and philosophy and economics was much more about what you do rather than what you are. So you're working class because you have a particular education set of circumstances. You work at a particular job. So it's an identity that is at least partially determined by who you are and what you do rather than what you are. If that makes any sense. I'm not sure I'm phrasing it well. I'm out of practice on videos, as you can probably tell, because I'm waffling on a lot. So one last thing that I did want to talk about. Haidt is particularly disparaging, though very politely so, about new atheism, but I don't think he quite understands new atheism, because he is making a utilitarian argument essentially for religion and other social binding techniques, and treating religion in particular as technology that we use to create group identities which are useful. He also talks about corporations and nations and so on. Atheism is not really concerned with whether religion is useful, though that has been talked about in various books. Dawkins dismisses it as being incredibly patronizing and arrogant to say, oh, well, religion, it keeps the little people happy, and he objects to that as an idea. Dan Dennett talks about belief in belief, which is what Haidt seems to be displaying in this book, that people don't believe what the religions are saying necessarily, but they believe that belief is important, or at least important for other people. And again, that's a rather horribly patronizing point of view. Atheism is not concerned, or the new atheism, as extolled by the Four Horsemen, is not concerned over whether religion is useful or not, because we can probably get most, if not all, of the same benefit from secular institutions, pastimes, hobbies, communities, and so on. It's concerned over whether it's true, because if there is a moral or ethical assumption at the heart of at least the new atheism, if not atheism as a whole, I would say that it is the idea that all right action must proceed from truth, in that in order to effectively do something, we must first understand something. And if we're retreating from truth, then we cannot possibly hope to do the right thing, because we have no guiding light, no idea of what the right thing is. So if we look at, say, Islam, can we say that it is probably conducive to human flourishing to force women to always be accompanied by a family member and to dress them in circus tents and all the rest of it? Probably not. But that behaviour stems from the idea that what's contained within the Quran is true, but it isn't. So if we're going to select a right action, what is the best way to treat women in our society? You have to start from a basis of truth, which would be that they're not lesser, right? That they're fully realised human beings with a rich internal lives, capacity for intellect and all the rest as men, right? That's the truth of the matter. And if you operate from that truth, what conclusions will you come to, and are they the same ones that religion's going to come to? So I don't think he understands that new atheism is not about utility, it's about truth. I don't think he understands what the underlying moral idea behind that is, and that truth is generally the best thing. And I also think he underestimates how new atheism skepticism can argue for both a relative set of ethics and an evolutionary set of ethics that can be circumstantial and so on, that it's adjustable in a way that religion isn't, because religion tends to be hidebound and doesn't change generally without violence or schism, right? And while Atheism Plus may show that even atheism can have this problem, or the skepticism bubble can show that atheism has this problem, overall, nobody was killed or burned at the stake for disagreeing with each other. A few careers were harmed, but that's probably about it. So I don't think he understands the new atheism, and I also don't think he properly understands Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene. He spends some time talking about group selection, but the selfish gene is a way to explain group selection. Because if you look at gene propagation and the benefit to genes rather than the benefit to the individual, then you can understand. So going back to the anthills, all those workers share genes with the queen, so it's in the gene's interest for the hive to do well as a whole, even at the expense of individuals. Right? So ant drones can die off in droves so long as the hive survives. That's to the benefit of those genes being passed on to the next generation, and so on. I also don't think he quite understands the interplay of memes and how many new atheists describe religion as being a disease or a parasite. It's because its behaviour is very much like that. And what's good for the meme in this instance may not be what's good for the individual, the biological individual. There may have been benefits to particular religions in the past. That doesn't mean that there's benefits to them now, that they haven't become toxic. Wisdom teeth used to be good, right? Now they cause us nothing but trouble. The appendix, similarly, right? These are things that were good adaptations in the past, but aren't good adaptations in the present. And similarly, mimetic organisms like religions may have been very useful in human prehistory, but are they useful today? Or has their relationship with humanity become toxic and parasitic? And are they true? Which is the point Haidt seems to miss, that is made from the New Atheism. So that would be my chief criticisms of this, in that I don't think he groks New Atheism or meme theory with fullness, and so he stumbles quite a lot when it comes to that. But in terms of defining moral schema and encouraging people to understand each other and to understand that other people have different morals, I think it's useful. In understanding our relationship between our consciousness and our intuition, I think it's useful. But I felt like such an alien reading this book because so little of it was relatable. I think because I've always been a more conscious individual, which isn't necessarily a good thing, trust me. And I've never had that Hive experience, so a lot of it was like an alien's handbook for discussing humanity. So hopefully that's satisfied the person who bought that for me. I hope to be back on videos, but I'm still very tired and burnt out, but I will do what I can. Hopefully this wasn't too waffly and you got something out of it. It is well worth buying and reading. Even if, like me, you're going to take issue with some of the things he says, I think it's useful and it will encourage you to try and understand the point of view of the other, the moral and ethical schemes of the other. I don't think it did necessarily for me, but I think it's an heroic effort. Zang. Pulp Nova is a collection of short stories in the old pulp style but with a modern twist. You should find something here you like, from western to mythos horror to science fiction. You can get Pulp Nova at Drive-Thru Fiction, on Amazon, or in hard copy from lulu.com.